I'm painting Mandalorians today because I think Mandalorians are special to me in a Legion context, because they were my first miniatures I tried to paint. But also because of what they represent for Star Wars. I'm drawn to Mandalorians. I mean, everyone's drawn to Mandalorians, right? They're made as a product to draw us to them. But I think Mandalorians are special because they illustrate one of my favorite things about Star Wars. And that is what it means as a story, right? So I think we have a big problem in the way that sometimes we talk about Star Wars, because we want there to be canon. Canon is this concept that modern fan communities borrow. They borrow it from religion, and the idea is there ought to be a set of stories and ideas that is more or less correct, that everyone can accept as the baseline. But the problem is that often the canon setting things are visual storytelling elements, right? Star Wars canon comes from movies originally. And movies don't operate on the same rules as religious texts. You see something in the background of a movie and it's canon to the Star Wars fan. But it's a prop to a movie maker. And that actually creates some problems for our ability to watch and understand the movie. And it creates very serious problems for our ability to talk about it later if we're so obsessed with creating it as canon, right? And I think Mandalorian is one of my favorite examples of that. So because of the process of movie making and storytelling, over time, we've got 3 or 4 distinct ideas of what it means to be a Mandalorian. And the reason I don't like the canon model for understanding this is because they're all interesting and useful. All the different models of Mandalorianism are interesting and useful. So the first one, the one that George Lucas introduced when he first wanted to create the character of Boba Fett. Boba Fett was developed for The Empire Strikes Back, and one of the only things we were told about him before the movie came out was that he wears Mandalorian armor. A word George Lucas just made up, right? And when he wanted to provide background information about what Mandalorian armor was, it was an elite fighting force of Jedi killers. That's what Mandalorians were. Mandalorians at that time were a regimented army. They were a regimented army that was dangerous because the only thing we knew about them is that they killed Jedi. And the only thing we know about Jedi is that they're awesome. So Mandalorians are an elite army that kill the really cool Jedi. Now, that concept of Mandalorianism actually lasted pretty long because it was a while before authors really started to flesh out what Mandalorianism meant to them. So the first example of Mandalorianism is George Lucas's Boba Fett armor backstory. Well, later, we meet a new Mandalorian in George Lucas's work, Jango Fett. And it was at that point that authors were given the ability to flesh out what Mandalorians meant. But at that point, rather than nothing in George Lucas's imagination as our places to get information about Mandalorians, now we had a long series of fan relationship with a guy named Boba Fett. So when it comes to defining what makes a Mandalorian now, we have this example. Now the problem is, when George Lucas created Boba Fett, he didn't say Boba Fett is the ultimate Mandalorian. He said Boba Fett wears Mandalorian armor. But if you want a story about Mandalorians, in the back of your head, you're thinking, I'm going to get stories about more Boba Fetts. So that's what people wanted. So the Mandalorians at that point became known not as a regimented army of Jedi killers, but they became a group of people who are organized in these honor-bound clans. Clan Mandalorians became the new way of thinking about Mandalorianism. And it wasn't what George Lucas originally intended, but it was really cool. And so to have Mandalorians in this context now, they're not a regimented army. They have custom, bespoke armor. They're not necessarily evil. They're honor-bound, which can mean a lot of different things. It's kind of a sci-fi trope, right? But it really works for Mandalorians. And they're dangerous. They're warriors. So now Mandalorians are these warriors with custom armor. It's a society of Boba Fett's. And they live in secret, and they have customs, and they have a religion, and they're very cool. And this is the kind of Mandalorian that dominated the fan imagination for a long time. This became the canon Mandalorian. And this is when Mandalorian cosplay and Mandalorian fan fiction and Mandalorian novels really came into play. And the Mandalorians were contrasted against the clone troopers, who some Mandalorians were brought in to train. So in our stories about Mandalorians now, the interesting thing is their differences from the regimented clone trooper army. Now you'll notice, the original Mandalorian concept is still there. The regimented army of Jedi killers is just called something else now. It's the Grand Army of the Republic. It's the Clone Army. And they're all clones of a certain Mandalorian, Jango Fett, but they're not necessarily Mandalorians themselves. Although, and some authors did consider them to be, which is interesting. All right, so now we have the Clandalorians, we have the Clone Army, and then we have Boba and Jango Fett. And then George Lucas got involved again. And the Clone Wars TV show gets made. And in the Clone Wars TV show, they visit Mandalore, the home of the Mandalorians. And then we get yet another vision of Mandalorianism. And here, Mandalorians are presented as a pacifist society trying to turn its back on its violent roots. Okay, that's interesting. Very different than any Mandalorians we've seen before. And the vision of the previous Mandalorians we see is now represented as the Death Watch. The Mandalorians who just want to cause trouble. The Mandalorians who in the narrative of the story are very much the bad guys. And their vision of Mandalorianism is misguided. And the Mandalorians themselves are much less, they look significantly less like the concepts of honor-bound warriors and clans that we were accustomed to. Now, this upsets some people, but it's really interesting. You can't deny that it's interesting. So now we have a third vision of what a Mandalorian is. And it doesn't completely erase the existence of the other visions. You'll notice there's an additive nature to this, right? But it does complicate it. Now, if we're obsessed with canon, we say, well, George Lucas has decreed, right? This is what Mandalorians are and what they represent, and that's that. But what's way more interesting to me is the contrast between the visions of Mandalorianism. This vision of Mandalorians becomes canon, and very interestingly, they narratively and unnecessarily in the script insist, they make a point to stop the conversation about plot-related things and have a little chat about Jango Fett, because the Mandalorians in the show have to make it clear, Jango Fett is not a Mandalorian. This is George Lucas asserting his original vision of Mandalorianism. Boba Fett wears Mandalorian armor. He's not necessarily a Mandalorian himself. But the books, the stories, the backgrounds made it very clear that Jango Fett is a Mandalorian. And more importantly, Boba Fett, his son, is the thing after which most Mandalorians were modeled. So now the ideal, typical Mandalorian is not a Mandalorian. It's interesting. All right. Well, then, of course, The Mandalorian becomes a TV show. The Mandalorian comes out. And this happens after the acquisition of Star Wars by Disney. And Disney wiped away all the previous canon. And, it was irritating at the time. We were all scared about the future. What does it mean that canon can get wiped away? Well, what it means is that they wanted to tell more stories, because it actually worked fantastically to wipe away all the canon. Because now we hear that there's going to be a show about a Mandalorian, and we know that there are these competing visions of what Mandalorians are. So what does the show do? Well, the show retains everything about Mandalorianism in the past that they want to, and ignores what they don't want to, and just tells a story. And it's a good story. It's an additive story. But it contradicts some things about Mandalorians. They add the insane, at the time, stipulation. Oh, by the way, Mandalorians are not allowed to remove their helmets. And if you remove your helmet, you're no longer a Mandalorian. Now that was a very disorienting thing for someone who's kept up with Mandalorianism over the years. Because even the best Mandalorians have taken off their helmets at times. Even the most hardline Death Watchers took off their helmets when they wanted to talk to somebody, when they wanted to have a snack. And now we have a show that has a vision of Mandalorianism that contradicts the past. Rather than disruptive, though, we got one of the most interesting and cohesive fictional ideologies in Star Wars. And it was a good story, so we went with it. Okay, so at this point, canon seems to be at its most useless, right? But Star Wars fans need canon. Eventually, in Mandalorian Season 2, they introduce, well, actually, there's different Mandalorian cults. Different Mandalorian religions who treat Mandalorianism differently. And I think this was the first success of the canon problem in the Star Wars universe, because they approached a both-and solution, but you can't always, right? Like, there are some things that just contradict. And they tried to come up with an elegant solution where Boba Fett was kind of a Mandalorian, Jango was an adopted Mandalorian, some more bigoted Mandalorians don't accept that a Mandalorian can be a foundling. There's different Mandalorian movements, there's the Death Watch, and then there's the Children of the Watch. But none of that really matters, because it's all in service of just getting the best story out of this information. Because it comes down to the fact that canon is not the best model for storytelling in a Star Wars universe. Canon is distracting. Canon keeps us from focusing on what makes Star Wars valuable, right? What makes Star Wars a good story. You know, the Star Wars as a vehicle for storytelling has its most value when its mythic qualities are able to come through. So George Lucas wanted to tell a story about the decline of democracy in the prequels. He wanted to tell a story about autocracy rising to power. He wanted to tell a story about executive coups. He wanted to tell a story about the interplay between corporate politics and national politics. And he wanted to tell a story about the rise of Darth Vader. And so, in the name of these things, he rejected canon regularly. I don't even know if he knew about the complicated 6-layer scheme of canon that the Star Wars fans had developed over time. The Wikipedia standard. He didn't care, because his only purpose in telling the story was to tell the story. And the story elements were background to that. And it's good, because it got us the prequels. And it got us the Clone Wars show. And during that era, canon kind of worked, because canon reacted against a man's vision. George Lucas made a choice, and then everyone scrambled to figure out how that choice can make sense. And that was fine. That worked. But now that George Lucas is gone, canon has become it's become untethered from vision. It's no longer a reaction to someone's storytelling ideas. It is in itself the driving force. But the thing that I like about Mandalorians is that they're all different visions of Mandalorianism are interesting. And there's merit to including all of them in the way we talk about Mandalorians. So, this is why I am particularly drawn to Mandalorians in the context of tabletop wargaming and wargame hobbying. Because when you come together to make an army for a wargame, you have to make choices, stylistic choices, and how you're going to model them and how you're going to paint them. So I, in Legion, usually play as the Empire. And I like the Empire, I like painting the Empire, but I do miss some of the flexibility that can come with other factions. I'm not going to paint blue stormtroopers. It's wrong, because what the Empire represents in Star Wars is that homogenizing hegemonic force. The Empire represents that which makes everything else standard. So the Empire is humanocentric, because humans are the default in Star Wars. The Empire is tyrannical, because democracy is chaotic. The Empire represents order. The Empire represents tyranny. It represents, a lot of people say fascism. I don't actually think most of the Empire is all that fascist, but that's maybe a conversation for a different day. But the Empire is evil. It's tyrannical. It's oppressive. It's brutal. But what the main thing the Empire does is it erases and homogenizes. So what I wanted for all my other armies is I wanted to lean in to the diversity of culture in the Star Wars universe. I wanted rebel factions that were able to illustrate that there are other cultures in the galaxy. Now, I started this quest before there were Ewoks, so maybe in another world, if I'd started Legion later, maybe I'd be the Ewok guy by now. But when I started, the one thing that the rebels had that indicated that there were other cultures present was Mandalorian resistance fighters and Clan Ren. And I wanted a rebel force that was capable of doing that. But my first stab at painting was not great. I was learning, right? My first Mandalorians didn't look that good. So what I was able to do recently is I dipped them all in some chemicals and stripped them of their paint so I could start over with my Mandalorian army, which is what I'm painting now. And that process of stripping Mandalorians down of their paint and starting back up from the front just really got me thinking about Star Wars, about Mandalorians and Star Wars and the way they keep getting stripped down and rebuilt and reimagined. And so I'm painting my Mandalorians here in the, I'm definitely keeping with the traditions of the show as established, but I want these Mandalorians to emphasize the patchwork nature of Mandalorian culture in Star Wars. So some of them are going to be regimented, some of them are going to be clean, some are going to be dirty, right? Some are going to look honorable, some are just going to be criminals. I want their armor to be mismatched. I want them to look like they have pieces of armor from different Mandalorian groups, right? Because I want these Mandalorians to really represent what Mandalorianism is meant for Star Wars. And so that's what I'm trying to do here. And today all I'm doing is just adding some details to the bodysuits. I have used, so far on these Mandalorians, I started with primer, then I airbrushed on a color, like so, and then I used oil paints I used oil washes to bring out, to add some depth and to add some distinction to the armor plates. And now I'm going back and I'm adding bodysuit elements so that the armor pieces pop out better. And then I'm going to repaint most of the armor pieces on these Mandalorians. But the other problem here is that, I like Rebels in Legion. I like the models. I like the way that they're set up. But I do want my Rebel forces to really emphasize Star Wars cultures. My goal is that if you sit across from me at a table and I'm fielding a rebel army, I want you to be able to tell immediately from the look of my army something about their recruitment. I want you to know what planet they're from. I want you to know what brought them together, where they recruit from. I want you to be able to tell from them ideology and culture. Ideology and culture, that's my goal. So my first attempt, I'm gonna try and make an army that is primarily Mandalorian. Now, there's a challenge there because there's really only a few Mandalorian units that are rebel capable. But this is what makes the hobbying and arts side of miniature painting so valuable. Because I am going to modify every unit in this army to have Mandalorians in it. So one of this vision has been with me from the start. So when I first, I said my first miniatures were Mandalorians. And my plan from the very beginning was that I wanted to modify things. So here, let me just grab one of my very first models. And I'm not going to strip these because I love how they turned out, right? But I wanted Mandalorians to be driving my land speeder. So, land speeder DeLoreans. But I've been modifying other units from there. It's not going to be a particularly meta army because I'm emphasizing things that can be modified to look Mandalorian. I've got, let's see here. I am going to make use of some mercenary forces so that we have Mandalorians on speeder bikes, and in an homage to the show, one has a silvered spear, right? So that's going to be one way we approach this. But the biggest problem, of course, is the core units. There are no Mandalorian core units, and core units are difficult to modify to look like Mandalorians. And that will be the subject of the next time that I ramble while painting.